she'd flop right on top of me. And when she felt I was paying attention, she'd push away from me and smile. It almost killed me smiling. I loved every minute of it.
There was a time when charm could carry a man further than truth ever could, and few men understood that better than Tony Curtis. He had the face, the voice, the presence, everything Hollywood demanded. And for a while, it seemed like his life was exactly what others dreamed of. Fame, beauty, endless attention. But behind that effortless smile, there was something unsettled. A man who kept moving forward, yet never seemed to arrive. Because Tony Curtis didn't just fall in love once, he fell in love many times. And yet, as the years passed and the noise faded, one truth remained. Only one woman ever truly held his heart. And perhaps in his story, you may remember something of your own. The love that once felt like home, Janet Leigh. Chapter 2. The love that once felt like home, Janet Leigh. Before the fame fully settled in, before the world began to shape him into something larger than life, there was a love that felt simple. Her name was Janet Leigh. They met at a time when everything still felt possible. Tony Curtis was young, ambitious, still finding his place. Janet Leigh carried a quiet elegance, grounded, composed, and far less restless than the man who would soon become her husband. Together, they became something Hollywood rarely creates anymore. A symbol, a marriage people believed in. They built a life that looked complete from the outside. Two rising stars, a growing family, a sense of balance between ambition and belonging. For a while, it wasn't an illusion. It was real. But success has a way of changing the rhythm of a life. As Curtis's career began to accelerate, so did everything around him. The attention, the expectations, the constant movement. And somewhere in that movement, something quiet began to slip. Not loudly, not all at once, just slowly conversations became shorter, absences became longer, and the space between them, once filled with understanding, began to feel unfamiliar. Janet remained steady. Tony did not. And sometimes that's where the distance begins. Not in conflict, but in contrast. For Curtis, the world was opening. For Janet, something was beginning to close. They stayed together longer than most expected, long enough to convince themselves that what they had could survive the changes. But some loves don't break suddenly. They fade while no one is looking. And by the time you realize what's slipping away, it's already gone. The mistake that changed everything forever. Christine Kaufman. Chapter 3. The mistake that changed everything forever. Christine Kaufman. By the time Tony Curtis met Christine Kaufman, his life was no longer simple. He was no longer the young man building something steady with Janet Leigh. He was a star now, desired, admired, surrounded by opportunity and temptation. And Christine was something entirely different. She was young, just 18. There was a softness to her, a kind of innocence that stood in sharp contrast to the life Curtis had already begun to live. Where his world had become complicated, hers still felt untouched. They met during Tus Bulba, and almost immediately, something shifted. It wasn't quiet. It wasn't careful. It was fast. For Curtis, this wasn't just attraction. It felt like escape. A step away from responsibility, from expectation, from the growing distance he could no longer ignore in his first marriage. But not all escapes lead somewhere better. Some only take you further from what mattered most. The decision came quickly. Too quickly. He left Janet Leigh. And just like that, the life that once felt certain was gone. In its place, something new began. A marriage built not on time or understanding, but on emotion, intensity, urgency. For a while, it worked. They had children, shared moments that on the surface looked like happiness. But underneath, the same restlessness remained. Because the truth is, changing the person doesn't always change the pattern. And Curtis had not changed. The same movement, the same distance, the same quiet drift. Christine had stepped into a life that was already shifting. And no matter how much she gave, she could not steady it. Some choices feel right in the moment, even necessary. But time has a way of revealing what they really were. And for Tony Curtis, this was not just another love story. It was the beginning of something he would repeat again and again. The marriage that quietly slipped away. Leslie Allen. Chapter 4. The marriage that quietly slipped away. Leslie Allen. By the time Tony Curtis entered his marriage with Leslie Allen, something in his life had begun to slow. The intensity of earlier years, the headlines, the sudden decisions, the emotional highs had softened into something quieter, less visible, less dramatic. And perhaps for the first time in a long while, there was space for something resembling stability. Leslie Allen was not part of the Hollywood spotlight in the way others had been. She wasn't drawn to the attention nor shaped by it. And that difference mattered. With her, Curtis stepped into a life that felt more grounded. They built a family. They shared years that didn't demand constant movement. From the outside, it looked like he had finally found a rhythm he could keep. And for a time, maybe he had. But not all distance announces itself. Some of it arrives quietly. There were no dramatic turning points, no sudden fractures, just a gradual shift, so subtle it could almost be ignored. The conversations became routine. The presence became expected. And somewhere along the way, the connection began to fade. Not out of conflict, but out of absence. Because stability, without depth, can begin to feel like silence. And silence has a way of growing. Curtis remained there longer than in his previous relationships. 13 years. Long enough to suggest something real, something worth holding on to. But time alone does not guarantee closeness. Sometimes it only stretches the distance. He had chosen a quieter life, a steadier one. But the restlessness within him had not disappeared. It had only become harder to see. And eventually even that quiet life could not hold. No arguments that defined the end, no moment that explained it completely, just a realization that something essential was no longer there. Some marriages don't collapse, they slowly stop being alive. Chapter 5. The pattern he could never escape. Later wives. The pattern he could never escape. Later wives. By the time Tony Curtis moved beyond his third marriage, something had already begun to repeat. Not loudly, not in a way that immediately stood out. But if you look closely, the pattern was there. Different names, different beginnings, but the same ending waiting quietly each time. His marriage to Andrea Savio came at a stage in life when many begin to slow down, reflect, choose carefully. But Curtis did not slow down. The connection, like others before it, began with energy, with possibility. A sense that perhaps this time things might settle into something lasting. For a while it seemed they might, but time revealed something familiar. Distance returned, not as conflict, but as absence. And when it ended, it didn't feel surprising. It felt expected. Then came Lisa Deutsch, a marriage so brief it almost passed unnoticed. Less than a year, a beginning that never had the chance to become anything more. By now the pattern was no longer subtle. It was clear. Connection, followed by distance. Hope, followed by quiet detachment. And then later in life, there was Jill Vandenberg Curtis. She was younger, much younger. And with her came something different. Not intensity, not chaos, but a kind of companionship that remained until the end of his life. But even here, the past did not disappear. Because patterns don't simply vanish with time. They stay, they shape, they echo. Curtis had spent years moving from one relationship to another, searching for something that always seemed just out of reach. And by now, it was no longer about the women. It was about the space within him that none of them could fully fill. Some people don't realize they're repeating the same story until it's already been written again and again. The women he could never hold, the affairs. There were marriages. Chapter 6. The women he could never hold, the affairs. And then there were the moments in between. The ones that came quickly, burned brightly, and disappeared before they could become anything real. For Tony Curtis, those moments often took the shape of unforgettable women. It begins, as it often does, with Marilyn Monroe. During Some Like It Hot, what existed between them wasn't subtle. It was intense, unpredictable, the kind of connection that felt powerful in the moment, but difficult to hold on to. There were delays, frustrations, moments that tested everyone involved. And years later, Curtis would say something that stayed with people. Kissing Marilyn Monroe was like kissing Hitler. It sounded harsh, almost shocking. But it wasn't really about her. It was about the tension, the exhaustion, the emotional chaos that surrounded her at that time. Because behind the frustration, there was also something undeniable. Presence, vulnerability, a closeness that didn't feel stable but didn't feel meaningless either. Then there was Natalie Wood. With her, the tone felt different. Softer, less chaotic. A connection that hinted at something more grounded, but never stayed long enough to become it. And beyond them, the world of Hollywood offered no shortage of temptation. Anita Ekberg, Mai Van Doren, Wanda Hendricks. Each brought beauty, presence, a moment that for a time felt complete, but only for a moment. There were others, too. Names spoken quietly, sometimes only as rumors, like Grace Kelly, whose connection with Curtis was never fully confirmed, yet never entirely dismissed. Or Terry Moore, another chapter that remained somewhere between truth and memory. Individually, each of these women represented something different. Together, they told the same story. Connection without permanence, closeness without stability, desire without direction. Curtis had access to everything most men could only imagine. And yet, none of it stayed. Because moments, no matter how powerful, never become a life. The one woman who truly stayed, Janet Leigh. In the final stretch, Chapter 7. The one woman who truly stayed of his life. When everything had slowed and the past no longer felt distant, Tony Curtis was left with something simple. Not the fame, not the roles, not the endless faces that had come and gone, just memory. And in those memories, one name remained clearer than the rest. Janet Leigh. She had been there at the beginning, before the noise, before the complications, before the pattern had fully taken shape, at a time when love didn't have to compete with anything else. And perhaps that's why she never truly left him. Not in the way that mattered. He had known many women, some unforgettable, some intense, some meaningful in their own way. But none of them carried what Janet had given him, a sense of home. Not perfect, not untouched by change, but real in a way that didn't need to prove itself. And that is what makes it harder to lose. Because it's not just the person you lose, it's the version of yourself that existed with them. In later reflections, there was a quiet honesty in the way Curtis spoke about his past. Not dramatic, not defensive, just clear, as if finally he understood something he hadn't been ready to see before. That not every love is meant to be replaced. Some are meant to be recognized, even if it comes too late. Janet Leigh was not just another chapter in his life. She was the one that made everything else make sense. The one he moved away from. The one he never truly returned to. And the one who, in the end, never fully left his heart. Because sometimes, after everything we chase, we realize the truth wasn't ahead of us. It was behind us all along. In the end, the life of Tony Curtis was not just a story of fame or success. It was a story of searching. He had everything many people spend a lifetime chasing. Recognition, beauty, endless opportunity. And yet, like so many of us, what mattered most was something far quieter. Not every connection becomes a lifetime. Not every moment turns into something lasting. But sometimes one person does. And perhaps that's what stays with us. If this story meant something to you, take a moment to like the video. Share it with someone who remembers these days. And subscribe for more timeless stories like this. And tell me in the comments, do you believe we only truly love once?